Resume the recording and let's get started. Okay. So the first question I had today was talking about natural monopolies and what is the difference between a natural monopoly and a normal monopoly. So kind of a natural monopoly is just naturally occurring. And the reason for that is usually because the firm has high fixed costs and increasing returns to scale. So it's important here because monopolies do not necessarily have high fixed costs and increasing returns to scale. So that's kind of the difference between, or the reason why a natural monopoly is slightly different than a normal monopoly. So another question was asking about price discrimination. And so price discrimination can benefit buyers because if buyers are willing to pay more for something, if price discrimination is not perfect, then the buyers will have an increased consumer surplus. And I think the question was also asking kind of if if price discrimination impacts firms. And so it's actually hard to say, and specifically for imperfect price discrimination. And the reason for that is actually because if there's some sort of consumer surplus, it doesn't necessarily get impacted because of imperfect price discrimination. And the reason for that is because when firms have some sort of price discrimination, usually that can result in things like different classes of service on trains or planes rather than one class of service. So like imperfect price discrimination can kind of result in different levels for different types of goods. So that's one of the reasons why it doesn't necessarily negatively impact firms or consumers don't dislike price discrimination, or I should say imperfect price discrimination, just because when there are different classes of service, that can actually benefit consumers and benefit the companies as well. So that's why there's not necessarily something wrong with imperfect price discrimination. And so then another question was asking about why is it that a lot of economists prefer private monopolies to public ownership? So I think the first thing is that while that is kind of like a good generality, not all economists prefer private monopolies to public ownership. And the reason is that economists usually think the market achieves better outcomes than the government. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's kind of the general rule, is that the economists tend to be more focused on the private market and the private market outcomes than government influenced outcomes. That's changing quite a bit more recently, especially with a lot of companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, because a lot of the government entities think that there should be, or a lot of economists think that there should be more government regulation on those firms. Okay. So moving on to the next question. So the next question, we're looking at a graph of a monopolistic firm. So we have the average total cost curve, the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the marginal cost. So the first thing we want to remember is that monopolists choose to produce where MR is equal to MC. So that's where monopolists are choosing to produce. So we know then that this is going to be the point where the monopolist produces. So that's important because we know then that this is going to be their chosen quantity for the monopolist. But that's not what this question is asking. This question is actually asking something different. So this question is actually asking about for the competitive firm. So for a perfectly competitive firm, the marginal revenue curve doesn't exist. Remember, for perfectly competitive firms, marginal revenue curve is not a thing. They don't have marginal revenue curves. So for the perfectly competitive firm, they're going to produce where the price is equal to the marginal cost. So that in this case, we know that the marginal cost curve is H. So we know that in this case, the firm is going to be charging a price of H. That's their price. And to determine the quantity, we're going to need to look at the demand curve, which the demand curve intersects the marginal cost curve here. So we know then that for the perfectly competitive firm, they are going to produce where the price is equal to H and quantity is equal to L. So this question was kind of a trick question because it was asking you to look at a graph of a monopolistic firm and determine the perfectly competitive outcome. But to do that, all we have to do is just look at the marginal cost curve and the demand curve, and the intersection point is going to be where the quantity and price are going to be. Okay. So for the next question, it was asking about what is the price that consumers pay in a market for a good in a monopolistically competitive market. So once again, we remember that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost for the profit maximizing monopolist. So because of that, we have the intersection point of marginal cost and marginal revenue right here. So this is the quantity that the monopolistically competitive or monopoly firm will produce. So then the next thing is, though, we need to determine what is the price. So what is the price that this firm is going to charge in the market? And this is where it can kind of be a little tricky because you could think that it's 12, but it's not actually 12 because remember the monopolistically competitive firm has a marginal revenue curve and a demand curve. And so consumers pay the price on the demand curve, which in this case, you just go up and over. So this is the price that consumers pay for this particular good. So we have then the quantity in this market for the monopoly firm is going to be 12 and the price is going to be 20. So that's how we determine the price and quantity in this market. And remember, this is the price that consumers are paying for the good. It is not the price that the firm is paying to produce the good. That would be at whatever this was here, at the intersection of the quantity and the average total cost curve. Okay, so the next question I had was asking about kind of perfect price discrimination and how you determine the revenues for a firm. So this question was specifically asking about what are the total revenue, so what is this box right here, if the firm produces a quantity of 3. So remember, the first thing here is that this is perfect price discrimination. So the firm is not going to charge each individual the same price for the good. So because of that, the firm is going to charge the first person $160, the second person $150, and the third person $140. So what that's going to look like is you have one person purchasing the good at 160, one person purchasing the good at 150, and one person purchasing the good at 140. So when you add all those up, that comes out to 450. And so that is the total revenue at a quantity demanded of 3. Okay. So the next question was how to determine a rival and excludable good. So the first thing I think is helpful is just kind of taking a look at the little table here to determine what is excludable and what is rival. So the first thing for excludable, what excludable really means here is just that you can stop someone from using the good. So for example, like private goods, those are goods that people own. So people own those goods, so you can stop other people from using them. And the same is true of a club good, because you have to pay for telephone service or electricity. What that really means then is that you can, people who don't want to pay for those goods are not going to be able to consume the goods. So you can exclude people from consuming them. Whereas common goods and public goods, you can't stop people from consuming those goods. For example, like public libraries, playgrounds, or public goods, roads, bridges, and dams. So those are kind of goods that you can't really stop people from consuming. So that's excludable. So the next thing then is rival. So rival basically means that if I consume the good before you consume the good, that decreases your ability to use the good. So private goods are like that because if I purchase the last item of clothing in a store, that means that you're unable to purchase that item. So that's why private goods are rival. For common goods are rival because, like, think about a public library. Like if I check out the book that you wanted, you cannot check out that book. Therefore, the goods are rival. For non-rival, if we think about things that are non-rival, that means just that if you are using it and I'm using it at the same time, that doesn't impact anyone. We can still both get the same amount of quality out of the good. So that's true of like telephones and electricity. Like if I'm using electricity in my home, that also means my neighbors can be using electricity as well. The same is true for public goods. So like roads, bridges, and dams, anything that like a road or a bridge, as long as it's not really congested or really full of other cars, if I am driving my car on a road, that means you can also drive your car on the road, and that doesn't impact anyone else's ability to use the good or to actually get some sort of kind of gain in consumer surplus from the good. Okay. Then the next question was having to do with monopolistic competition, and it was kind of asking, why is there deadweight loss under monopolistic competition? So it's a really good question. And the reason for that is because the firm is charging a price higher than marginal cost. So that's really important. So the reason why there's deadweight loss for monopolies and monopolistically competitive firms is because firms are charging a price higher than marginal cost. But remember, for monopolistically competitive firms, they always usually transition to perfect competition. And when they transition to perfect competition, there is no deadweight loss because the price is equal to marginal cost. And the firm in the long run is earning zero profits. Okay, so another question was kind of similar to the first question that we were going over. And it was asking about perfect price discrimination. So in the real world, perfect price discrimination is actually very difficult, if not impossible to achieve. And the reason for that is because it's almost impossible for a firm to know what every single consumer wants to pay for a good. That's impossible to know. So most companies practice things like imperfect price discrimination. And they do this through ways, like I mentioned earlier, where they offer slightly different classes of services for a higher price. So like airlines offer first class, business class, economy. Trains offer economy, business, and first class. So that's how they're able to have some form of price discrimination, but it's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect because there are people in business class who would be willing to pay more for business class. The same is true of first class. There are people in first class who would be willing to pay more for first class, but are not paying more for it. And price discrimination can impact consumers' trust, which I also mentioned a little bit before, but usually consumers do not care about price discrimination. And the reason is because it's not perfect. Because firms cannot perfectly price discriminate, that's one reason why consumers don't care as much. And also because companies are incentivized to offer slightly different classes of services. So consumers see this as some sort kind of like justified because there are those different levels of service that you're paying slightly more money for. So that's kind of the difference or the reason why consumers tolerate some form of price discrimination. And I believe that was the last question according to. So the question was asking, in what scenario do firms exit the market? So in the short run, firms exit the market when they cannot cover their average variable cost. So in the short run, the only thing that the firm needs to cover is their average variable cost. In the long run, though, the firms exit the market when they cannot recover their total costs. And the reason for that is because in the long run, remember, fixed costs become variable costs. So in the long run, the firm doesn't have any fixed costs and they can freely exit the market. And so that's really important because that allows the firm to just look at their average total costs or their total costs when making an exit decision. Okay. So then the next question was asking about how do we determine the profit for a firm by looking at their graph, or a profit for a monopolistically competitive firm by looking at their graph. So that's also a really important question. And the first thing to do is we need to notice that the monopolistically competitive firm has the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve, and that those are two separate curves. So we have the demand curve, marginal revenue curve, we always have marginal cost, and the average total cost. So remember that monopolies produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, which in this case is this point. So we know that the monopolies are going to produce a quantity of 120 units of the good. And we also know that consumers are going to pay a price of $4 for the good. But the firm, in this case, their cost is only $3 per good. So then this box is going to be the firm's profit. And to determine that, all you would do is just take the $4 minus $3 and then multiply that by 120. And so that is going to be the profit for the firm. So basically just 1 times 120 is going to give you 120. So that'll be the firm's profit in this example. And basically just the way you determine profit, really simply, the difference between the firm's average total cost curve and the intersection point on the demand curve. So what consumers are paying versus what the company is paying to produce the good. Okay. So the next question, and this one is actually a question a lot of people ask, so it's pretty important. The idea behind this question is that we're thinking about perfect price discrimination, and we're being asked to determine what is the total revenue at 3 units of the good produced. So because we're being asked to determine the total revenue at 3 units of the good produced under perfect price discrimination, we cannot simply take 3 times 140, because that's just going to give us the total revenue under a normal firm. So because this is perfect price discrimination, we have to do it a little bit differently to determine what the total revenue is. So to do that, we are going to have to take the price at each level. So we're first going to have to take 1 times 160, 1 times 150, and 1 times 140 to determine the total revenue. So 1 times 160, 1 times 150, and 1 times 140 is going to give us 450. So then the total revenue under perfect price discrimination is going to be 450, because the company is going to charge the first consumer 160, the second consumer 150, and the fourth consumer 140. And that is how we determine the total revenue under perfect price discrimination, I should say. Okay, and so the next question, and this was also a very good question too. And the interesting thing with this question was actually to determine this in kind of like a fully accurate way, you do need to know a little bit of calculus, but in this class, we're not going to be using calculus to determine marginal revenue curve. So to determine marginal revenue from an algebraic example, the first thing you need to know is the demand curve and the supply curve. So in this case, we have both demand and supply. And remember, in this case, because it's a monopolistically competitive firm, supply is also equal to the marginal cost curve. So supply and marginal cost for monopolistic firms is basically the same thing. Unless the question tells you something different, these are basically synonymous. You can say supply and marginal cost are the same. So we have our demand curve and our supply curve. So now how do we determine marginal revenue from these equations? So it's actually really, really easy. The only thing that you do is you just take the demand curve here and you simply double the quantity to get marginal revenue. The actual process is a little more complicated. You actually take the derivative of the total revenue, but we're not going to get into that in this class. The only thing you need to remember is just that you're going to double the quantity. So we had the 2/5 in the demand curve here. So we're just going to take the 2/5 down here, double the 2 to get 4/5. So now we have our marginal revenue curve. And the nice thing is that once we have the marginal revenue curve, all we need to do to determine where the firm is going to produce is just set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, because that is where the monopolistic firm produces that. So all we do is just take the 24 minus 4/5 Q and set it equal to the supply curve or the marginal cost curve, which is 4 plus 1/5 Q. And when we solve those equations, we get Q equals 20. And then to determine the price, all you would do is just take the original demand curve and plug in the P equals 24 plus 2/5 times 20. And then you solve that to get the price. So we're simply just taking the quantity and taking the original demand to get the price. And remember, this is the price that consumers are paying in the market for the good. So really important, this is a price consumers are paying. Doesn't tell you the price of anything else, just the price consumers are paying. Okay. So the next question was interesting. It was asking about why does the government usually control, or why might the government control certain monopolistic firms? So the reason for that is that the government wants to have some form of regulation over monopolistic firms, because monopolistic firms have a lot of power in the market to charge consumers whatever they want. But I think it's also important to remember that the government doesn't control a lot of firms in markets that are somewhat have somewhat of a public good or service. So if we think about, like, in the United States, we have the US government owns the United States Postal Service, but there are also private firms like FedEx and the UPS, which are private, and they offer similar services to the United States Postal Service. But I think the thing that's most important here to kind of take away from this question is that when you're talking about things like this, it's really, really important to remember that when the government controls the United States Postal Service, prices are much cheaper if you want to mail something via the Postal Service than if you want to mail something via FedEx and the UPS. And the reason for that is because government ownership allows the United States Postal Service to offer lower prices, effectively subsidizing mail delivery. So that's kind of one of the reasons that government directly controls specific public goods or services, because they want to make sure that everyone has access to that. So like in the United States, the government keeps the price of the services that the United States Postal Service offers very low, because if you wanted to have a private company offer those services like FedEx or UPS, it would be much more expensive.
Professor?
Yeah.
By government controlling the USPS, does that also force FedEx and UPS to control their prices?
Somewhat. That's a good question. So somewhat. So the kind of what happens usually in this case is that the firms like FedEx and UPS will offer specialized services, and usually basically the reason why they're kind of in business is because they can offer things at a faster speed than the United States Postal Service can. So that's one of the reasons why private firms exist in the market for like shipping goods, because they can do things faster. But by doing things faster, they are going to charge you a lot more money. Yeah, that's one of the main reasons is like they have different classes of services. And it's almost kind of an example of imperfect price discrimination, because if you were okay having your good not shipped as quickly, then you can use the United States Postal Service. But if you want it shipped more quickly and you're willing to pay more, you can use FedEx and UPS. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So then the next question was asking about kind of a more complicated example from I believe this was from chapter, I want to say, let me see. I think this was from chapter 14. Yeah, chapter 14 and additional problems. And this was question 9. So this question is basically asking, there's only one firm that produces and sells soccer balls in the specific country. And there's no international trade. And so these equations here are giving you the firm's demand, marginal revenue, total cost, and marginal cost. And so the first thing they're going to ask you to do is they're going to want you to determine what the quantity and the price in the market is. So remember, for a monopolistic firm, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So we're just going to take the marginal revenue curve. And notice here that the Q is doubled from what we talked about previously. To determine marginal revenue curve, you just double the quantity on the demand curve. So we have our marginal revenue, we have our marginal cost. So we just set those equal to one another and we get a quantity of 4. Then to determine the price, we just plug in the quantity of 4 to the demand curve. So 13 minus 4 is going to give us 9. So we have our price and quantity in the domestic market with no international trade. Okay. Now to determine our profit, what we need to do is we need to take the total cost and determine total revenue. So remember, total revenue is just price times quantity, and total cost in this case is just this equation, and you're going to plug in 4 to the quantity. And there's 2 quantities there. So you just set total revenue minus total cost, which when you solve is 36 minus 15. And that is going to give you $21. So the firm is making a profit of $21 before trade. Okay, but now the country opens itself up to international trade. And now the problem tells you the world price is $8. So remember before we had the price of $9 in the domestic market. So now we have the world price of $8. So because the world price is going to be different, we know then that all we need to do to solve this is to basically change the marginal cost to $8. So marginal cost here is just going to be $8. And what we're going to do is just plug that into this equation right here, the marginal cost equation. So we can get the quantity. So we have the $8 from the world price and the quantity. So we get a quantity of 7 under the new world price scenario. Okay. So then in this case, the case we just mentioned where the world price is $8 and the quantity is 7, the price without trade is higher. So you remember before that the domestic market price was $9. So the domestic price was higher than the world price. And so the country is an exporter. And this is because effectively the claim in this chapter, or in the prior chapter, chapter 9, assumed that the domestic market was competitive. So now we know the domestic market is not competitive because it's a monopolistic firm. And so because of that, because we know that the claim made in chapter 9 that it was domestically competitive because it's a monopolist firm, what happens then is that it starts producing a greater quantity, and this greater quantity gets it closer to the perfectly competitive outcome, because the price is now going to be lower than the prior price. Okay, and I believe that was the last question. Okay, well, I hope everyone has a great holiday. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stick around and ask them, or feel free to email me. But have a great rest of your week. Cheers.